They discovered a lost human fleet trapped for 20,000 years. Then the commander woke up. The debris signature was too symmetrical to be wreckage. Arik Sen watched the scan rebuild itself for the third time, confirming what a random field of dead metal had no business confirming. 41 capital hulls, locked in a perfect ring around the dead moon Pelorok, every reactor reading zero, every hull facing outward like they were still standing guard after 20,000 years of total silence. She should have filed it as found salvage and moved on. That was the protocol. That was the economy. Unclaimed wrecks, abandoned tech, first claim wins the contract and the credit transfer by nightfall. Instead, she pulled the archive on the hull markings. Old Terran, a language 3 centuries dead, last updated in a database nobody had reopened since the entry was filed. The markings were clear: Sol Defense Fleet, flagship designation, Anvil's Patience, command signature on file, Marin Thighs. The archive listed a casualty status in a footnote that had never once been verified by a living source. Presumed extinct, presumed, not confirmed, not even checked. Sen's hands stilled above the console. She was 8,000 years old. She had watched empires collapse and rebuild themselves in the dust of older empires' collapse. She had never once seen a ship marked extinct come back to life. And yet, all 41 reactors were dormant, not dead. There was a difference. A dormant reactor could be counting the years in slow cycles, patient, waiting, while the universe assumed it had stopped counting long ago. She pulled a second archive, then a third. Every file on humanity in the salvage registry was flagged identical. Status unknown, last contact 20,000 plus years ago, legal presumption of extinction per Concord Maritime Code 331.7. No one had ever rechecked. Sen stood and walked to the observation window of the archive station. The hollow ring was invisible from this distance, too far, too small against the dark, but she could feel it out there. 41 ships in formation, facing outward. The way a fleet stands guard, not the way wreckage lays dead. She had filed the discovery under standard salvage protocols. The Threll Ascendancy's legal claim system was ruthless but transparent. First verified catalog gets the contract. First logged. First claimed. So she had filed it. 41 dormant vessels, ancient human design, salvage rights pending. The automated system had assigned it a claim number within seconds. Then she had read the hull markings a second time. And a third. And she had not sent the filing to the auction exchange. She should have. The law was simple. The protocol was clear. But Sen had learned something in 8,000 years that most species never got time to understand. A record stops being a fact the moment no one checks it again. A file that no one opens might as well be a file that was never written at all. She had her grandmother's words on that. Some promises are kept by silence. The old Sevri archivist had stitched into her letters before she died. Not all of them need saying out loud. The wait lasted 14 days. Fleet Marshal Korath Vale read the salvage filing in his command suite aboard the quiet ledger, the Threll Ascendancy's primary cutting barge. His dorsal ridge was bronze-plated and exactly the color of old medals. He had 9 of those, one for each successful campaign, one for each profitable contract where the salvage yield exceeded projections. The 9th was the newest. He wore them on his ceremonial gauntlets the way humans wore scars, as proof of a life spent cutting things apart and getting paid for it. The filing said dormant fleet, salvage rights pending, archive status, presumed extinct. He read the hull markings once. Old Terran, flagged 3 centuries dead. He did not reopen the original archive to verify the status. He did not need to. The Concord Maritime Code was clear. Wrecks this old, no living species claiming them, no active communication signals, legal salvage. His. He spent 4 minutes reading the technical inventory instead. 41 capital hulls. Shield grid architecture he did not recognize. Hull compositions that suggested older Terran manufacturing standards. Valuable. Enough to matter. not enough to be careful about. "Process the contract," he told his adjutant. "Pull Captain Arsai's crew. Strip everything. We have the auction deadline in 8 days." He did not know that Sen had filed a formal objection. She had standard protocol, an archivist's due diligence, but it had landed in his queue as a single-line item, and he had scrolled past it in 5 seconds without reading more than the first word, objection. He dismissed it the way a man dismisses the hum of old machinery, the way a man dismisses anything that sounds like it might be right if he listened too hard. Captain June Arsai had been cutting salvage for 6 years under Korath Vale, and he had learned not to ask questions about why the fines took so long to process. The bureaucracy ran on its own schedule. When the order came, he was ready. The quiet ledger was positioned. The cutting crews were already suited. The salvage contract was final. Arsai was the kind of soldier who did his work without thinking too hard about the politics of his work. He had 9 campaign medals because he was good at following orders. The hollow ring was another wreck, another contract, another payment cycle. His crew sealed their suits and prepared the first cutting torch. Inside the sealed dormancy pod marked Commander, Marin Thighs had been mid-sentence for 20,000 years. And if we're still holding this position in another 1,000 years, we'll need to cycle the... She never finished. The pod systems had kept her exactly as she was, breathing, alive, waiting for the next second that never came. Her boots were positioned on the floor plates, exactly where she had planted them the day the alarm sounded. The day everything went quiet, the reactors throttled down to their lowest pulse, and the fleet entered the long sleep. Around her, the anvil's patience held its position. Around that, 40 more capital hulls did the same, all facing outward, all waiting. Her uniform still bore the rank cuff her grandmother had stitched by hand and had never once explained why it had to be silver. Thighs had never asked. Some things pass down without explanation. Some things are kept by the body, not by words. The pod's LED still showed green. Ready, waiting. The cutting torch burned through lead plating. Arsai's crew had breached maybe 2 meters of the outer hull when the temperature readings on their suit displays began to tick upward. A fraction of a degree, nothing dramatic, nothing that should have been there. "Thermal signature from inside," one of the crew said into the channel. "Faint, moving." Arsai checked the readings himself. The ship's reactors were supposed to be cold. The archive said so. 20,000 years cold, dead for every single one of them. And yet, the temperature kept climbing. "Cut wider," Arsai ordered. "I want to see what we're dealing with." The torch widened. The opening expanded. And from somewhere deep in the ship's core, something that had been breathing on a cycle of 1 full rotation every 11 years for 20,000 years began to speed up its breathing. The dormancy pod hissed. Arik Sen, watching the live feed from the salvage site through a connection that Vale did not know she had, very carefully did not move. In 9 minutes, she would send a message to Ambassador Nor Idris, whose grandmother had been Sevrai, whose grandmother had been friends with Sen's grandmother, whose grandmother had left her a silver-threaded cuff and a promise that someone would come back. But for now, Sen watched the thermal readings climb. And she waited. The file was never updated, neither were they. The cutting torch opened the hull in widening arcs. Arsai's crew worked with the calm of men who had done this 100 times before. Strip the salvage, extract the valuables, close the contract. They did not know they were cutting into a ship that was counting the seconds until it could move again. The lead plating fell away. Behind it, another layer, then another. The thermal signature strengthened with each breach, no longer ambient ghost heat, but something with a pulse to it, something that accelerated as the torch cut deeper. "Full reactor signature," one of the crew reported. "Not cold, not dead, dormant." Arsai's hands stilled on the torch controls. He looked at the readout twice, as if the second look might change what the instruments were telling him. It didn't. "Stand back," he said into the crew channel. "I'm pulling the torch. Let's see what happens if we stop cutting." The command reached Fleet Marshal Vale through a routine status update log to his tactical display. Salvage crew halted at second-level hull penetration. Thermal signature elevated. Recommend protocol review. Recommend protocol review. As if protocol were something a man, 3 centuries removed from a dead species, needed to review. Vale did not even glance at the Sevri's formal objection still sitting in his queue. He pulled the archive file on the Sol defense fleet, the same file Arik Sen had read 3 times, and spent 8 seconds scanning it. The casualty status, the presumed extinction, the note that no living source had verified the finding in 20,000 years. 8 seconds was enough for Coreth Vale. He had campaigns one on less. "Tell Captain Arsai to resume cutting," he said to his adjutant. "The thermal signatures on old ships don't mean anything. It's residual heat in the shielding. Perfectly normal." It wasn't. He knew it wasn't. The archive data on human dormancy reactors was sparse and 3 centuries old, but it was clear. A reactor that ancient, operating on minimum cycle, would take weeks to produce detectable heat above ambient cold. Not minutes. But Vale had 9 campaign medals and a closed case file, and the auction deadline was in 8 days. He had not stayed profitable by re-examining his certainties. He had stayed profitable by acting on them. "Resume cutting," he ordered again. "Full torch. Strip the second hull layer in the next cycle." In the archive station, Arik Sen watched the thermal readings climb past tolerances that should have triggered a full safety alert. She stood up from her console. Her hands found the encryption key her grandmother had given her 40 centuries ago, back when such things still mattered, when Sevri archivists could still block Threll overreach with bureaucratic force. The encryption was obsolete. The law had changed. Threll salvage rights now superseded every cultural protection the Sevri had once held. But the channel itself was still live. She opened it and pulled together everything she had. The scan data, the unverified archive entries, the hull designations, the thermal progression, and one sentence that she had been waiting 14 days to send. The file was never updated. Then she routed it to an old embassy channel, one that still connected to the last human diplomat stationed in the Ascendancy. Ambassador Noor Idris was processing trade requests in her office when the encrypted message landed on her personal terminal. She did not recognize the sender's call sign. She did recognize the image attachments in the message, the constellation of 41 hulls arranged in perfect formation. She recognized the hull designation in the data, Anvil's Patience. She recognized the name printed in the archive file, Marin Thighs. Her grandmother had repeated that name every single night before she went to sleep. Every night for 70 years, from Idris's childhood until the old woman died. Idris had never asked why. Some things pass down without explanation. Some things are kept by the body, not by words. She looked down at her wrist. The silver-threaded rank cuff was still there, exactly where her grandmother had put it. Frayed with age, the thread pale against the dark fabric. "Come back," her grandmother had whispered whenever she wound it. "Whoever you are, wherever you are, come back." Idris closed all her other windows. She sent a single message to the Transport Authority, emergency diplomatic priority. Destination, Hollow Ring salvage site. Departure in 1 hour. Then she grabbed the cuff and walked for the docking bay. At the 40% mark of the script's runtime, at the exact moment, the cutting torch burned through the second hull layer and exposed the inner systems of the Anvil's Patience. Something woke up inside the command deck of Coreth Vale's salvage barge. The dormancy pod's seals broke with a sound like an exhalation. "Need to cycle the shield grid every 19 rotations if we're holding this position long-term," Commander Marin Thighs finished, as if the sentence had never been interrupted, as if 20,000 years had been nothing more than a held breath. She opened her eyes. The pod interior was exactly as she had left it. The small, stitched cuff was still on her wrist. Her boots were still positioned exactly where her feet had planted them. The logs on the bridge console were still streaming in real time, waiting for her next order, operating under the last protocol she had set. Dormancy mode, active. All reactors, minimum cycle. All weapons, armed and safe. All crew, suspended, awaiting command resumption. She looked at the chronometer. 20,317 years. Thighs did not panic. She had trained for this. All of them had trained for this. She keyed the open channel to the defensive grid and transmitted the first of the warning protocols, an automated message on a loop, the way you warn something away from your position when you are trying very hard not to declare war on it. This is the Sol Defense Fleet. This is Anvil's Patience Command. You are in proximity to active military assets. Alter your course. This is an automated warning. Alter your course. The warning cycled once, twice, a dozen times, reaching out into the dark where a salvage barge was busily cutting the outer hulls open. Vale heard it on his tactical display, a ghost signal that made no sense and therefore required no response. It's a recording, he told his bridge crew. An automated loop, probably triggered by the hull breach. The ship's trying to warn us away like it did for thousands of years after it died. It doesn't know it's dead. The recording doesn't know. He said it with the certainty of a man who had already checked the file and decided what it meant. Continue cutting. He sat in his command chair and ran his fingers over the kill tally carved into the armrest. 9 campaigns. 9 successful salvage operations. 9 times he had decided what a wreck was worth and been proven correct. The recording cycled again. The warning. The same words, the same automated tone, the same ghost voice from a ship that had not fired a shot in 20,000 years and had every intention of never firing again. And Vale, who could have reread his own file, who could have opened the Sevri's objection, who could have hesitated for even one breath and broken his own momentum, instead counted his medals aloud to himself and ordered the cutting torch to burn hotter. The reactors of the Anvil's Patience began their wake sequence. Deep in the ship's core, 41 power plants that had been cycling once every 11 years started to accelerate. Once every 5 years, once every 3. The acceleration was smooth, precise, calculated to avoid catastrophic surge. Thies had designed the wake protocol herself, and she had designed it to be invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. No one was looking. The ship's defensive grid recalibrated its targeting arrays and went live. Arik Sen watched the reactor signature on her monitor climb from dormant to active to hot, and she understood, with the certainty of a mind 8,000 years old and never once overruled until now, that she had just set the final piece in motion. She recorded it, every second, every data point, every moment that a man named Korath Vale sat in his command chair, counting medals instead of reading files, and refused to believe what his own senses were telling him. The part-split rehook landed like a closed hand against a table. And no one was ready. Ambassador nor Idris's transport cut through the salvage zone at velocity that would have triggered a dozen regulatory warnings if anyone had been paying attention to her flight path, instead of the thermal blooms lighting up their tactical displays. She had the silver-threaded cuff wound around her wrist and her grandmother's name in her mouth, ready to speak it if someone asked, who had authorized her to break embargo protocols and cross into an active salvage zone without escort clearance. No one asked. No one was monitoring anything except the ship that was waking up in front of them. The Anvil's Patience resolved on her viewport in stages, first as a thermal signature, then as a hull profile that matched nothing in the current naval registries, then as 40 capital ships arranged in perfect formation, every reactor climbing toward full operational readiness, every weapon system spinning up from dormancy like a man opening his eyes after a long sleep. Idris watched the shield grid come online. It was architecture she had never seen before, a layered defensive mesh that predated the Threll's entire shipbuilding doctrine by millennia. The shields locked into formation with the other 40 hulls, creating a unified perimeter that made the Threll salvage barge look like a mote of dust caught in a geometric pattern too large to escape. On the bridge of the quiet ledger, Coreth Vale watched the same readings resolve on his tactical display and had exactly 8 seconds to understand what his sensors were showing him before his pride made the choice for him. The reactors were not dead. They were not even dormant anymore. They were running at full operational capacity. The power signatures were climbing. The weapon systems were spinning live. The defensive grid that had just come online was not a relic. It was active. It was now. It was here. For 8 seconds, Vale considered rereading his file. He did not. Instead, he keyed the open channel that the automated warning system had been broadcasting on loop for the past. He checked his chronometer, 47 minutes. And he listened. For the first time since the cutting began, someone listened. Marin Thies sat in the command chair that had held her weight for exactly 6 years before everything went quiet. The logs were still streaming. The crew roster on her tactical display still showed every officer in their assigned position, suspended in the dormancy pods, waiting for her next order. She took a breath. Then she keyed the emergency frequencies and opened a channel to the ship that was cutting into her hull. "This is Commander Marin Thies of the Sol Defense Fleet, flagship Anvil's Patience," she said, and her voice came through the speakers in the Threll salvage barge like a ghost refusing to stay buried. "Your salvage operation is halted, effective immediately. You are cutting into active military assets. Stand down your equipment and alter your course, or I will be forced to take defensive action." The voice was quiet. That was the part Vale had not anticipated. No rage, no panic, no desperation. Just a woman who had woken up after 20,000 years and was still patient enough to warn someone before she killed them. In the archive station, Arik Sen watched the channel open and heard Thies speak for the first time in 20,000 years, and she understood the exact mathematics of what she had just set in motion. A woman who could wait that long would not panic in 9 minutes. A man who had counted his medals instead of reading his file would not hesitate for even one. Sen had 9 minutes before this became something that could not be taken back. She made sure the recording was locked. She made sure every sensor data point was archived. She made sure that if this ended the way the mathematics suggested it would end, there would be a witness to the exact moment when a closed file and a dismissed objection collided with a woman who had been patient for 20,000 years. Vale's hands stilled on his command chair's armrest. The carved tally marks, 9 of them, one for each campaign where he had been certain and been proven right, felt suddenly small under his fingertips. He looked at the chronometer. He looked at the reactor signatures, still climbing. He looked at the open channel, where a voice was waiting for him to respond. And he said, "This is Fleet Marshal Coreth Vale of the Threll Ascendancy Salvage Division. Under Concord Maritime Code 331.7, you are classified as derelict vessel, legal salvage rights assigned. You are not authorized to activate weapon systems. Stand down, or..." The channel cut to silence. Not an interruption, not a noise, not a warning. Just the absence of Thies' voice and the presence of 41 ship reactors spinning up to their maximum operational capacity, and the understanding, slow, terrible, and absolute, that a woman who had not fired a shot in 20,000 years was about to make her second decision of the day. The first had been to wake up. The second was already in motion. At the 70% mark, at the exact moment where most viewers stopped paying attention to what happened next, Idris's transport reached the edge of the hollow ring and locked into a stabilized orbit. She could see everything from her viewport: the formation of human ships, the shield grid geometry, the Threll salvage barge sitting at the center like a moth caught in a web it did not understand it was inside. She could see Coreth Vale's flagship registering the data on its screens, still broadcasting its insistence that the Anvil's patients did not have authorization to do this. And she could see something else. The space between the human ships beginning to light up as targeting arrays came online, as weapons that had been locked in safety protocols for 20,000 years started to run through their pre-firing sequences. No shot had been fired yet, but the mathematics of what was about to happen were already written into every power signature, climbing on every sensor display in the salvage zone. Idris reached down and took the silver-threaded cuff off her wrist. She held it in her closed fist the way her grandmother had taught her, not as a treasure to be displayed, but as a promise kept by the body, not by words. "Come back," the old woman had whispered. "Whoever you are, wherever you are, come back." On her personal terminal, a message came through from Arik Sen's encrypted channel. 2 words only: "They're awake." Thighs opened the channel again. 9 minutes, she said to the silence that was no longer empty. "I'm giving you 9 minutes to order your vessel to stand down and alter course. At the end of that interval, if you have not complied, I will treat this as a hostile action and respond accordingly." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The weapons systems speaking behind her words were louder than any voice could be. She started the countdown. 9 minutes. The same interval she had trained for in the dry runs, the same margin of safety she had built into the protocol. 9 minutes to let a man reconsider. 9 minutes to let him read his file. 9 minutes to let him understand that the universe had not ended 20,000 years ago. It had only stopped checking if he was still alive. And Korath Vale, sitting in his command chair with his 9 campaign medals carved into the armrest beneath his fingertips, began to count. Korath Vale did not spend the 9 minutes understanding. He spent the first 3 ordering his tactical officer to calculate an escape vector. The Threll salvage barge had limited maneuverability, but it had engines, and if he could break the perimeter before the human fleet solidified its targeting lock. He ordered the maneuver. The salvage barge shuddered as its engines spun up, trying to claw backward out of the geometric center of 41 ships that had been waiting 20,000 years for someone to give them a reason to move. It took the barge 1.2 seconds to clear the shield grid's inner boundary. It took the human defensive network 0.8 seconds to recognize that as a hostile action. Marin Thighs did not need to give a second order. The moment Vale's engines engaged, the targeting arrays that had been spinning live for the past 9 minutes locked onto every thruster, every hull plate, every centimeter of the vessel that had been cutting into her flagship's plating. The algorithms that had been written before the Threll's entire civilization had language to name themselves were already running. The firing solutions were already calculated. The only thing left was the certainty. Thighs kept her hand flat against the console. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She did not do anything except look at the chronometer, 8 minutes and 37 seconds remaining on the interval she had given him, and nod once to Casimir Drell, who had been waiting his entire life for the moment when his commander would give that signal. In the archive station, 412 kilometers away, Arik Sen watched the escape vector register on the tactical display at the exact same moment it registered on the human fleet's targeting computer. She pressed record and locked the file. On the viewport of her transport in high orbit, Ambassador Noor Idris saw the space between the human ships begin to light up with fire. Not slowly, not in sequence, all at once. 41 ships that had not fired a shot in 20,000 years opened fire within the same half-second, and the salvage barge Quiet Ledger was caught at the center of a geometric storm it had no technology to survive. Vale's static gray optic flickered once, registering the math a half-second after his actual eye already had. He had time to understand one thing, and only one. He had been wrong. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. It could have lasted longer, but Thighs had no interest in cruelty. 41 ships firing in perfect geometric coordination did not need to prolong what they had already decided. The salvage barge registered the incoming barrage at zero point 0.8 seconds to impact. It managed to raise its shields at zero point 0.6 seconds. The shields collapsed at zero point 0.2 seconds, and after that, there was nothing left that qualified as armor or tactics or anything but the sudden, absolute fact that a man named Coreth Vale had read a file from 3 centuries ago and never once considered the possibility that he might have been wrong. The quiet ledger was not destroyed in the conventional sense. What happened to it was more thorough than that. Thighs watched the engagement conclude on her tactical display, and then she turned away from the console and walked toward the bridge's observation window. Her boots struck the deck plating in a rhythm she had established 6 years ago before the long sleep. The stitched cuff on her wrist caught the light of the distant stars. She had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. The file in the Threll archives remained untouched for another 47 hours. No one looked at it. No one updated it. No one moved it out of the pending queue. The casualty status still read presumed extinct. The final verification date was still marked 3 centuries in the past. Then, at hour 48, Arik Sen's encrypted recording arrived at 3 different institutions simultaneously: the Salvage Registry, the Concord Maritime Commission, and the office of the last human diplomat still accredited to the Threll ascendancy. The file began to move. Thighs were still standing at the observation window when Idris's transport docked at the Anvil's Patience's auxiliary bay. She did not turn when Idris entered the command deck. She did not acknowledge the ambassador with anything more than a shift in posture. The silver-threaded cuff caught the light again as Idris approached. "My grandmother gave me this," Idris said, and she set the cuff on the console where Thighs had held her hand flat against the metal for 9 minutes that had compressed all of human certainty and Threll dismissal into a single moment of clarity. Thighs looked at the cuff. Then she looked at Idris's wrist, where the outline of the stitched fabric had pressed a pale mark into the skin, a ghost of continuity, a mark left by something kept against the body. "She stitched it herself," Thighs said. "It was not a question." Idris nodded. Thighs reached down and wound the silver thread once around her own wrist before she said anything else. The gesture was careful, precise, the way you handle something that has survived 20,000 years and might survive 20,000 more if treated with the patience it had already learned to keep. "We didn't vanish," she said, and her voice carried the weight of a woman waking mid-sentence after 20,000 years and finishing it anyway. "We throttled down." Idris understood then, not because Thighs explained, but because she had her grandmother's blood and her grandmother's stories, and because her grandmother had never once explained the cuff, only repeated the same name every night for 70 years. "Come back." They had. The file was never updated. Neither were they.